Welcome back to the future of. This is the space for those curious about the future. I tell you about the technologies, strokes of genius and discontinuities that could become big and shape the way we'll live tomorrow. In this episode. 1. Eye tracking and privacy. An in-depth look at how eye movement tracking technology can tell us so much more about people than we imagine and than we originally intended to understand. 2. Battery that lasts 28,000 years. The incredible story of an American startup that is using radioactively contaminated nuclear reactor parts and diamonds to make an almost infinite battery. 3. Motorcycle and battery swaps. The Big Four of Japanese motorcycling are teaming up to make swappable and standard batteries for their electric motorcycles, a potential revolution for the entire industry. 4. Smart sutures. A 17-year-old girl makes a low-cost suture thread that changes color in case of infection. It's not all sunshine and roses, but the solution is brilliant and could be useful in many developing countries and beyond. 5. DNA from the air. A group of researchers study a colony of mice for a year to see if it's possible to detect their DNA from air samples, and they find that it works, even on human DNA. Are you ready? Then hold on tight, buckle up, ready to go.
Silence, please.
Eye tracking and privacy. A few days ago, a paper was published that is making a lot of noise. The title speaks for itself. What does your gaze reveal about you? On the privacy implications of eye tracking. It talks about eye movements, which have long been a subject of research interest. Think about the fact that the first approaches to measuring the direction of a person's gaze go back as far as the 1800s. It was Louis-Émile Javel who noticed that while reading a text, regular eye movements are not involved, but a series of short pauses and rapid movements. And after him, at the beginning of the 1900s, Edmund Huey created the first contact lens that had a hole for the pupil connected to an aluminum pointer that moved in response to eye movements. A decidedly cumbersome solution. The first non-intrusive eye tracker was made in 1935 by George Buswell, who used a light source to illuminate the eyes. The reflection was then impressed on a film. Despite computers, digital technology and innovation, for a long time, these technologies remained severely limited by the cost of the necessary equipment, lack of accuracy, and poor usability. As a result, they were only used in very specific research niches. In recent years, however, with rapid advances in sensor technology and data processing software, eye tracking solutions have become easy to use, lightweight, efficient, and affordable, and have found increasing adoption in many fields, including gaming, marketing, automotive, military, and healthcare technology. The most popular method today is video-based eye tracking, in which mathematical models are used to calculate the direction of a person's gaze from video recordings, for example based on the shape and position of the pupil and iris, or based on light reflection patterns in the eyes. This method can be used not only in head-mounted devices, such as smart glasses and virtual reality headsets, but also through cameras built into laptops, tablets and smartphones without requiring any additional hardware. And what is emerging, and what the study discusses, you won't like at all. According to the literature reviewed, eye tracking data can reveal information about a user's biometric identity, mental activities, personality traits, ethnic background, skills and abilities, age and gender, personal preferences, emotional state, degree of drowsiness and intoxication, and physical and mental health conditions. Of course, the issue is not so much whether software is capable of knowing all these things, but whether it really does collect, store, and use this information in any way. And more to the point, whether the data collected for some purposes can later be used for other reasons as well, more or less without the knowledge of the person who produced it. For example, some of the categories of personal information listed above constitute sensitive data, for which special protection is prescribed by the European GDPR. Going into more detail, the problem doesn't seem to concern data collected during scientific experiments, which are aimed at studying some very specific aspects, but rather data collected by commercial devices, and which end up in the hands of companies that by definition are for profit. And this is because while consciously directed eye movements are part of the story, many aspects of eye behavior are not under the volitional control of the person. For example, glances guided by external stimuli, pupil dilation, eye tremor, and spontaneous blinks occur mostly without conscious effort, as do digestion and breathing. So, as is often the case, we produce data without even realizing it, and without being able to avoid it. And since many inferences, made on data collected for other reasons, have not even been discovered yet, but are being studied, we probably don't even have a clear perception yet of all that can be done with data. I mean, tomorrow we could be denied an insurance policy, because our car's sleep detector found out we'd been drinking, or receive an advertisement related to our gender or ethnicity because we've been playing with some virtual reality viewer, or even not be chosen among candidates for a job because some eye-tracking system estimated that our learning curve of some task was slow. In short, when they say the eyes are the windows to the soul, from now on this statement can also have many other meanings.
Battery that lasts 28,000 years. I realize that the title reeks of clickbait a mile away, but that's exactly why I decided to go investigate. And the innovation I'm about to tell you about is anything but a joke. This potential game changer comes from US-based startup NDB, which stands for Nano Diamond Battery, a diamond-based high-power alpha, beta, and neutron voltaic battery that its founders and researchers say could give devices green power for a lifetime. To build its nano diamond battery, NDB combines radioactive isotopes from nuclear waste with layers of paneled nanodiamonds. Diamonds are a rare and expensive material, we know that, but their extremely good thermal conductivity makes them even more unusual in the realm of device construction. Micro-sized single-crystal diamonds drive heat away from materials containing radioactive isotopes so quickly that the operation generates electricity. Because the battery is self-charging and requires only exposure to natural air, any excess charge can be stored in capacitors, supercapacitors, and secondary cells to extend battery life for cell phones, aircraft, rockets, electric vehicles, sensors, and other devices and machinery. If you have a bit of imagination, it will be clear to you how, from space vehicles to our smartphones, this battery would be something extraordinary. The idea, by the way, is not completely new. Already in 2016, a team of physicists and chemists at the University of Bristol had created a prototype nuclear-powered battery using nickel-63 as a source of radiation. NDB uses different materials to add legend to an already incredible story. According to press reports, the startup uses nuclear reactor parts made of graphite that absorbed radiation from nuclear fuel rods and became radioactive themselves. To be clear, the idea has gone from concept to realization, so the battery in question does not yet exist, but the whole thing seems to have a clear and defensible scientific basis. The problems, of course, are many. Each battery cell will only produce a tiny amount of energy, so the cells must be combined in large numbers to power regular, larger devices. As reported by websites that have already talked about this topic, according to the research of the University of Bristol, a battery containing 1 g of carbon-14 would provide 15 joules per day. A value well below an AA alkaline battery. And then, of course, there's the safety issue. NDB says, the battery cells along with the source are coated with a layer of polycrystalline diamond, which is known to be the most thermally conductive material, also has the ability to contain radiation within the device, and is the hardest material, 12 times harder than stainless steel. This makes our product extremely durable and tamper-proof. That's just a statement, we're curious to see the application in action, and apparently it doesn't look like we have to wait that much longer, as the startup has stated that the first working prototype will be available in 2023. Then we'll start talking about industrialization, because I imagine that the difficulties of handling such a complex and dangerous material on an industrial scale is the other big issue ahead as soon as the prototype is proven to work. As often happens, when I read about this project, I sensed the general skepticism that often accompanies great innovations. And also for this reason I decided to talk about it. It's not the right approach. Who makes innovation doesn't need skeptics to disprove. He needs to explain, and find someone who will accompany him to realize it. After all, wouldn't you like a battery that never runs down?
Motorcycles and swap batteries. While we wait for infinite batteries, something extremely interesting is moving in the world of motorcycles and interchangeable electric batteries. The Big Four Japanese motorcycle manufacturers, Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki, and Yamaha, have a plan to improve the adoption of electric motorcycles and make their vehicles even more attractive in the market. The four companies created an organization in April 2019 for this kind of purpose, called the Swappable Battery Consortium for Electric Motorcycles. What's more, the group has now announced that the manufacturers have agreed on specifications for electric batteries that can be swapped between each company's bikes. So if you have a Suzuki, you can use a Honda battery, or vice versa. Electric is certainly not just a topic for the automotive industry, and while the first name that comes to mind is probably Tesla, you might want to pay attention to Zero, Lightning, and Harley-Davidson as well. Zero sells premium electric motorcycles, and its latest model features 14.4 kWh lithium-ion batteries for a claimed 110 horsepower, which allows the vehicle to reach 200 km/h and cover over 300 km in the urban cycle. Lightning, on the other hand, has just launched a new bike for a decidedly more democratic price range, while Harley-Davidson, when it launched the Livewire model, caused a ruckus. Associating the legendary American brand, whose engines are known for their famous and recognizable rumbles, with the electric, seemed impossible. And while some have begun to interpret some signals from the Milwaukee company as a step backwards in the strategy on the electric, the Japanese raise strong. While battery swapping for cars still seems like a difficult concept to put into practice, for motorcycles we seem to be at the dawn of a new approach. Many companies have been experimenting with battery swapping that could be used for electric cars, including, in Honda's case, a mobile power pack and surrounding automated charging and swapping system, as shown at CES since 2018. More recently, startup Ampere has built stations that can complete an electric car battery swap in as little as 10 minutes. However, the struggles of Tesla and Israeli startup Better Place seem to indicate that battery swapping won't be practical for electric cars for some time. The only exception so far is Chinese automaker NIO, which operates a network of battery swap stations in its home country. The company said it completed 500,000 battery swaps in May of last year, and a few days ago, at the end of March, the incredible number rose to more than 2 million. The agreement between Japan's Big Four motorcycle makers opens up interesting scenarios, and moreover right away on a global scale, unlike NIO for cars, which is still a Chinese-only concept. Manufacturers would be able to sell motorcycles with or without batteries, since the buyer could already have a battery from his previous bike, or simply from another bike he already owns, without having to incur a new expense. If for whatever reason a user needed a replacement battery, it should be easy to get one, as the same type would support bikes from a variety of manufacturers. With multi-brand standardization, the dream of battery swap stations at this point could become much more feasible. Not to mention that having batteries that are relatively easy to remove, because they are smaller and less heavy than car batteries, could also be perfect for apartment dwellers, since you could just pull the battery out, take it home and charge it like any other device in the wall socket. Before we get excited, however, we must remember that the Swappable Battery Consortium is a creature only Japanese and should not be confused with other associations, which also include the same Japanese motorcycle manufacturers, but around the world. This standardization for now seems to be a benefit that the Japanese will enjoy first, not to mention that it could also operate as a barrier to entry to other competitors who do not have the same standards. But in any case, the mere fact that four companies the size of Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki, and Yamaha have agreed on a standard, frankly seems to me to be a Nobel Prize achievement. Man today can never agree on anything.
Suture Smart. Deja Taylor is a 17-year-old student at Iowa West High School. Just an ordinary one on the surface, except that over the past 18 months she has juiced about 3 dozen beets. These root vegetables, she discovered, provide the perfect dye for her invention, suture thread that changes color, from bright red to dark purple, when a surgical wound becomes infected. An invention that in January earned her a nomination as a finalist in the Regeneron Science Talent Search, the oldest and most prestigious science and math competition for high school students. Healthy human skin is naturally acidic, with a pH around 5. But when a wound becomes infected, its pH rises to about 9. Changes in that indicator can be detected without electronics. In fact, many fruits and vegetables are natural indicators that change color at different pH levels. Beets seem to be the vegetables that best detect changes in acidity. Next, Taylor had to find a suture thread that would hold up well to the dye. She tested 10 different materials, including standard suture thread, to see how well they were able to absorb and hold the dye, whether the dye changed color when its pH changed, and how their thickness compared to standard suture thread. After her school switched to distance learning, she was able to spend 4 or 5 hours in the lab on an asynchronous class day, performing experiments. And that's how he found that a cotton polyester blend performed best. After 5 minutes in contact with a pH similar to that of an infection, the cotton polyester thread changes from bright red to dark purple. After 3 days, the purple fades to light gray. Now, I imagine you're thinking that there are more advanced technologies, that all it takes is a sensor in the thread to alert a smartphone, or a doctor's computer that there is a problem. Or that all you need to do is reach out to a doctor who, probably at a glance, can recognize the onset of complications. This is very true, but only feasible in Western countries where wealth and technology allow all this. But in poor, developing regions of the planet, there may be few doctors and few smartphones, so a simple solution like Taylor's could be extremely valuable. You may also be wondering what the incidence of this problem is around the world. Is it really relevant? In some African nations, up to 20% of women who give birth by cesarean section then develop infections in the suture area. This number is certainly not negligible, considering that we are talking about areas of the world where the birth rate per woman is quite high. However, in the highly advanced United States, this percentage reaches 8%, so we can say that the problem is quite common. As always, however, we must not be simplistic or unreasonably excited by innovations. In addition to roses, there are also several thorns. Current suture threads do their job well, they are convenient, they are not irritating to the skin, and they are strong enough to hold a wound together. Beet juice dyed thread will have to compete on all of these attributes. In addition, surgical site infections can occur even beneath the surface of a wound, and color-changing suture thread would not help detect an infection beneath the skin. And finally, the same non-absorbency that makes standard suture thread difficult to dye with beet juice also keeps bacteria out. While it's true that the braided structure of cotton thread gives it the ability to pick up beet dye, it also provides its own hiding place for infection-causing bacteria. So here's where studies, testing and further improvements are still needed to ensure that an intriguing idea doesn't turn into a boomerang. Taylor will go ahead with her studies, but regardless of how it turns out, the mere fact that a 17-year-old girl, in the midst of a pandemic, has decided to do this thing, instead of sitting around chuckling on Instagram or dancing on TikTok, personally deserves praise.
DNA in the air. A group of researchers at Queen Mary University of London has demonstrated for the first time that animal DNA, including human DNA, can be collected from the air through so-called environmental DNA. This discovery creates new possibilities for forensic crime because it does not require hair follicles or other body tissues. The news is incredible, but it is science. Living organisms such as plants and animals are constantly releasing DNA into their environment, and environmental DNA has become an increasingly useful tool for scientists to identify which species live in a given environment. But until now, most research has focused on collecting DNA from water and, to a lesser extent, soil. For example, scientists have increasingly collected environmental DNA from aquatic environments to monitor fish populations or look for invasive species. But obtaining it from the air had not yet been done. In this new study, researchers investigated whether they could collect DNA from air samples. First, they sampled the air in a room that had been home to several rodents, and then examined that air for DNA sequences. The team successfully demonstrated that air DNA sampling detected rodent DNA from the room itself. And while this, logically, might have been an expected result, what the researchers didn't expect was to find human DNA in the samples as well. While the discovery of human DNA is perhaps the most interesting aspect for the general public, the actual purpose of the study was to help ecologists, for example, who often work with animals that are difficult to reach. The use of environmental DNA would provide an efficient and non-invasive way to monitor biological environments, for example in caves, tree cavities, or underground burrows, without even having to get close to the animals or disturb them. The discovery opens up new scenarios in the forensic and medical fields, but could also be useful in archaeological or anthropological studies. An example, very current, of medical application would be to analyze the transmission of airborne diseases, such as COVID-19. Right now, the guidelines for social distancing are based on physics and estimates of how far the virus particles can move, but with this technique, we could actually sample the air and collect real-world evidence to support those guidelines. This is a fundamental issue. Most of the decisions made around COVID so far have been based on estimates and assumptions, certainly true and even common sense, but with very little scientifically proven data behind them. We have heard that we must stay 1 meter away, then 2, then that environments must be ventilated, then that it stays on certain surfaces longer than others, but everything there is to know about this virus, we have yet to discover. The main question the researchers are working on now is how far this airborne DNA can travel, and how big is the space within which it is meaningful to conduct the analysis. It's obvious that the larger the spaces and the more air circulation there is, the more the DNA will tend to disperse, but it's one thing to make that assumption, and another to calculate a metric. So if you're thinking that in the next episode of CSI, the police will be able to discover the presence or passage of an alleged killer from his DNA in the air, that's not what we're talking about. And even using this method to discover Tutankhamun's genealogy from the DNA in the air of his tomb is probably still pure fantasy, but from what the English researchers imply, these are just the directions future applications could take.
Thanks for listening to the future of, really. You could have listened to the radio, you could have spun a vinyl, you could have put on a cassette, you could have used a stereo 8 to know what it was, but instead you preferred the future of. That's what I thank you for, and you still have hundreds of episodes left to discover. Today's sentence of the week, I'm replacing it with a plea to intervene in Myanmar. The coup that deposed President and Nobel laureate San Suu Kyi has already resulted in over 500 deaths, thousands of arrests, deportations, and mass escapes. While the international community mediates and seeks diplomacy, the Russian government has already sided with the military regime, demonstrating that the quest to prevail in the geopolitical field can pass over the heads of defenseless and blameless people, as if nothing had happened. I hope that all this will end soon, but not in oblivion. That's why it is important to talk about it.